Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell Gay. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Joined today by Marty Hansen. Marty's been an instructor in marketing and management for 12 years. He's also now the director of the brand new Center for Professional Sales Excellence over the last 6 months or so that's been in existence. Prior to you and I, he worked in sales and business development for places like 1-3 Design and Martin Brothers here locally. Found out earlier today he used to own a wine shop. We might talk about that a little bit as well. Done a lot in marketing and sales throughout his career. As far as education, his undergrad degree is from Rowan University, MBA from LaSalle. And we're going to talk all about sales today and hear several of the ethical dilemmas he's had to encounter over his career. So Marty, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
Oh, you're very welcome, Russ. Very welcome.
So where do we want to start? I know throughout your career and working in sales, I'm sure ethical dilemmas come at you fairly regularly, I would assume. So we can start wherever you might want to.
Well, let's do chronological.
That works for me.
So, my background, my first real, adulting type of job involved working for a regional bank in southern New Jersey, and I learned very quickly working in banking that back in that day there were a lot of the way business got done involved the expectation of people having, a high moral compass. And
that's not always a safe assumption, is it?
Right. That truly, I learned very quickly was not a safe assumption to make. And I found out in that role that so I grew up, with very strict Catholic parents who, the Bible was, or the good book, if you will, was, basically your guidebook. And, I think my parents did a phenomenal job of raising me to do what was the right thing, and how to treat people. And then I got into the real world as an adult and learned that, everything wasn't black or white.
Sure.
There's a lot of shades of gray when it came to how business got conducted. And the shades of gray often for me really challenged who I was as a person, because we all want to belong, we all want to be part of something, especially if we're young and in a corporate environment or in our first jobs. It's very natural to want to belong, prove yourself. And then you quickly learn that favoritism, for example, or, just plain flat out rude and ignorant behavior existed, and actually contributed to the success of the organization I was working with. So sure. It created for me anyway, wow, maybe mom and dad weren't right about everything, and you're young enough that you start questioning everything, despite, a lot of education. You were curious about my thoughts on whether ethics and ethical training in the classroom have improved or declined since my days of college education. And I will tell you, they very much improved. I remember, back in the day, we just touched on ethics, but again, I was really not prepared for having to make the types of decisions that I had to make. I think back to a gentleman who wanted to hire me from the bank into a political role, get involved in politics. And that gentleman later was indicted and sentenced to jail for acts that not only were immoral and unethical, but also illegal. So
Yes, we must have crossed that line somewhere in there.
yeah. But I guess I'm a big storyteller in my classes, and one of the stories I tell about my own ethical dilemma was when I actually moved on to the bigger companies and worked for GE Capital specifically. And I ran a division of the company there where they were so bottom line oriented that we were, as a manager, I was really pressured to let go or fire anyone who didn't make their numbers in a specific month.
Wow.
So I handled that in a way that some people would say was unethical. And I'm not ashamed to talk about it, because I think, as young people, part of our path involves, these types of decisions. Sometimes you make the right choice, sometimes you don't. I still to this day believe I made the right decision. So what I would do is I used to go, my role in addition to managing people was to go out and negotiate deals on behalf of GE. And those deals sometimes resulted in what we called getting an advance. So I got a check one time for $400,000. Company was going to market, they were going to put inserts in our monthly mortgage statements.
Okay.
If you're following me. And I took that check and rather than send it on to the accounting department, I put it in my desk drawer and held on to it for that month in which we didn't make our numbers. Because the month in which I received the check initially, we were good. We had made our numbers that month.
Yep.
So I kept the check. I kept the check in my desk drawer until November of that year.
Okay.
And I kept that check there, waiting for the month that we didn't make our numbers, and I would have been faced with letting go one of my staff. So I was very loyal to my staff. And I bring this up in the classroom, and students are like, especially the accounting majors, they're like, oh my goodness, that is just really, really wrong. And I'm like, well, I knew my staff had families and had financial responsibilities themselves. And I was very protective of my staff. And I didn't believe that 1 month of bad numbers should result in you getting fired from your job.
Yeah.
But that was the policy back then. It was
especially you mentioned this was November when you actually had to use that. I mean, now we're talking about firing people right before the holidays too.
Right.
A whole other issue.
Another whole issue. Yeah. And I think you make a really good point. There's no worse time to let someone go than during the holidays, you know, and I say that having had to let people go during the holidays in my past career. And it's just, it affects it. Some people think, oh, that was a callous thing to do. And I agree, but don't think it didn't have an effect on me. It really, truly did.
And so each month was completely independent of the months prior. I mean, you could bear numbers for a year straight and then have one bad month and you're on the chopping block potentially.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah, that's a bit harsh to say the least.
Yeah. That lasted and that was under us. I won't name any names, but there was a specific leader that was his style. That was his way, of running and managing his business operation, of which I was a part of at that time. So
wow.
Yeah, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's an understanding.
I've had bosses, and I've shared the stories of having, again, management has evolved greatly in the past 30 years that I've been a part of it, 30, 40 years. And I worked in the days when people would smoke in the boardroom and, that was like no big deal. So I come from a different era. And back then, I think ethics and having a moral compass, as I like to call it, was definitely on the lower priority list,
Right.
so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Well, that's encouraging. At least maybe we're getting better as far as the ethics component.
I really think I queried my class as recently as Thursday, what was it, yesterday, on how they would handle this situation. I working at one of my jobs. I replaced a gentleman and we did a ride along. We were in the same car together for 2 weeks as he transitioned the role to me.
Okay.
And the first thing I was asked to do was misrepresent the amount of miles I drove every month, because this person had been doing it for his entire career. And
Wow.
right. And so the
There's
dilemma that I was
welcome you to the company, isn't it?
right. Well, I had been, yeah. I mean, and as I explained to my students, because they were like, "Oh, this is an easy decision." I'm like, no. Bear in mind, this is day one of 14 or 10, day one of 10 days where we were sitting together in the car, driving to different accounts where I was being introduced as the replacement. And I got asked on day one, as we were on our way, 5:30 a.m. in the morning, on our way to our first account.
Yep.
Hey, listen, I need you to do me a favor. I've been bumping my mileage numbers by 1,000, and who is that hurting, really? The United States government, as he said to me, he's like, it's just because, Uncle Sam's always out to get us. And I was faced with, he's like, will you do that for me? And I paused. I think that really whacked him out.
I'm sure.
And I said, well, geez, in my head, I knew how this guy was connected to the company as well.
Absolutely.
He hunted and fished with senior management and did all types of extracurricular activities.
The old boys club is in action at its finest right here. Yeah.
At its finest. And so, I basically looked him in the eye and said, you have my word, I will do that. And then immediately, upon his retirement, I never did that.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if he ever found out, but
sure.
I was not about to misrepresent my numbers like that.
Right.
So, that was a challenging situation, when I own my wine bar, I always dealt with, salespeople have a lot of ethical dilemmas. And when I own my wine bar, is really just hand selling wine. Because and I say this, I don't know what your opinion is, but or what some of the listeners' opinions are, but I believe the sales world has more ethical challenges than any other profession or career that you could endeavor upon. And that's because salespeople typically are autonomous. We don't get micromanaged by our bosses. We're out in the field. We're responsible for our own behaviors, activities. I know salespeople that would say they were working and they'd be out on the golf course on a Friday,
True.
Who was to know? Who was to know?
Yeah. Accounting's probably up there pretty high too, but I don't think I would disagree with you for saying that sales is probably the highest.
And I think accounting, that you face a lot of ethical dilemmas there as well too.
Right.
It's just, I give another example of, when I worked for Martin Brothers, I often was asked to bid on supplies from a casino.
Okay.
And the casino had a bidding policy, and I happened to know that I was the only one that they bid jobs out to. They weren't
Wow.
bidding them out to multiple parties like the process requires.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I found that out, I tested it out. They needed a spatula one day.
Yep.
And I took a $5 spatula and I marked it up to $20 because we were able to do that. So I submitted the
A
bid
little
for
10
$20.
karat gold coating around the edges.
It was the best rubber spatula you ever laid eyes on. No, I did. I was like, and there was some work involved in little one-off items like that, but nothing that I thought warranted, marking the price up like that. But I did it because I was like, I'm going to test this out and see.
Yep.
And sure enough, I got the order.
Wow.
And so, my students roll their eyeballs when I tell them this. And I'm like, well, listen, put yourself in this position. What if you had a mortgage to pay, a car payment to make, babies to feed, and you knew that if you didn't mark that up, which you were well within your jurisdiction to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The client could say no. We weren't forcing anything on the client. And technically they were bidding the job anyway. It was up to them to say no to this crazy high price. Now, given those circumstances, what would you do? In my case, I was like, well, if they're not going to be smart enough to bid the job out now, I probably, in hindsight, again, I'm always learning, I probably should have just been fair. But
how many mistakes do we all make on a regular basis that we can learn from? And that's one thing that always bothers me with the students, this expectation they have on themselves from somebody in their past that they need to be perfect and can never make mistakes. And I will tell them from day one in my class, I'm pretty sure I've made more mistakes in life than all of you combined. So let's just start there and get past this. You're going to mess up at times. I get it. Nobody expects you to be perfect but yourself. So you need to change that mindset too. But
so true. I'm glad to hear you representing your human flaws, because I do the same exact thing in my class. First week, I'm like, hey, I just want to let you know, I do plan on screwing up. And if I do, if and when I do, make sure you let me know, which I think that helps put students at ease a little bit, because I think somewhere along the line, somebody did instill in them the you must be perfect mindset. And we're just not, we're just not.
We're not close.
I guess, I've dealt with students that have lied to me, that have let me down in a number of ways. And I'm not going to lie, I get angry about it, but I also let that anger go pretty quick. I think it's natural for someone to feel like you've been wronged, and it's a natural emotion to get angry, but I quickly get past it and recognize just who you are. You're a young person trying to figure the world out, and I was there once too. So
I had a student, speaking of the anger to that, I had a student a few years ago. She had taken a test early, had shared with one of her group members a couple of things that she thought he should study for because they were on the test. And then she felt so guilty. So she comes to see me. Here's what I did. I didn't tell him questions. I told him topics to look at. Are you mad at me? And I just looked at her for a second. I'm like, no, I'm not mad at you, but I'm very disappointed. And I thought that was the better option to answer her, but damn, the tears just start flowing instantly. I'm like, no, that's not what I was trying to do here. But I wanted her to not do it again, but I was appreciative that she told me the truth. And I just made her feel even that much worse in the process.
Well, we do get disappointed by our students, and I know that sometimes that's worse of, it's worse to tell them that
Yeah,
than to
I
just,
don't use the
so
word
I've been
hate
there,
crime, but unless it's
cheating
much
is
more
such a,
egregious, then I'll break that word out still. But
there you go. Cheating is continues to be a challenge in my
absolutely.
world. I'll tell you what's interesting about cheating is teaching in the MBA program. I've had a lot of my students from China cheat, and it so much so that I began talking about it with my peers, and it was very evident that cheating was a real issue.
Wow. Okay.
And I really diagnosed it. I really thought a lot about it. What's interesting culturally in China, at least this is how I justified their behavior in the classroom. They're a communist country.
Mhm.
And communism is founded on everybody working together toward a common goal.
Sure.
And I really got to a point where I believed that their cheating behavior was just a cultural difference compared to what we do here in America.
Okay.
Of course, I quickly had to explain, and I began explaining how I handled that was I began explaining that they were being taught the American way, and the American way was that we do not cheat under any circumstance. That actually
Only
helped.
that were true here too, though.
If only it were true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my stories of American students who,
I was just getting ready to tell the camera, by the way, US students, you're not exempt from this. So yes, I'm glad you're going down that path too.
Yeah. We actually, in my classroom, I always ask for the latest and greatest in cheating methods. And I solicit my students to ask them how many of them have cheated. I typically get about 90 to 95% of my class that have, of course, then I'm like, well, so what do you do? And I've gotten some great stories. I've heard some great innovative ways of getting a better grade on a test. But I do always explain, essentially you truly are cheating yourself, which can be difficult to really understand, because and then the end goal is, hey, I just want to get through this class that I really could care less about, And I understand
about
students,
their future careers. Then, I mean, we know the best predictor of future behavior is the past behavior. So if they try to cut the corners now, it's most likely that's going to continue into the future.
Yeah.
And
that's something that really they need to think about. And hopefully at some point in their life, that light bulb goes off. But,
and as harsh as it is sometimes to think they might fail a class or a big project here, it's still much more lenient than what might happen to them in the business world.
Exactly.
Later. So.
Exactly. I had a student, the most significant cheating story for me, or cheating incident, was a student who cheated in an effort to improve his grade from an 83 to an 85.
Wow.
And he what he did is
must be super hard to come by in your classes, Marty.
I still to this day, because I don't believe my classes are incredibly difficult. They're skill-based, but at that time I was actually teaching in the management department. It was, I think it was organizational management I was teaching.
Okay. Yep.
And to this day, I have no idea why. Maybe he was just trying to see if it would work, but he literally erased a Scantron answer. He wrote in the correct one, and unbeknownst to him, I had made a copy of all my Scantrons.
Okay. Yep.
prior to handing the originals out.
Wow.
And bear in mind, I hand out, well, when I did give those to, I purposely handed back the original Scantrons because I think that students should really face these challenges as part of their development. So, you know, if I find out that they do not cheat, you know, as a group, I always feel like, well, okay, you know, they certainly had an opportunity to erase a
Right.
couple answers and put the right
Yeah.
ones in. But it's just one of my ways
Wow.
of testing their moral fortitude.
Yeah. Look at, yeah. I mean, again, any way we can challenge that integrity a little bit and put better practices, better thought processes within them, I think is a good thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I had a student several years ago in leadership, my portfolios that I assign in there that had word for word plagiarized a former roommate's part of a paper that was several pages. So it was a fairly big part of the paper, but one of the sections he plagiarized was the values section that just went on and on about ethics and morals and high integrity. And I'm like, really?
Wow. Wow.
So yeah,
That takes the cake. That takes the cake.
and then, so I use Turnitin. So I mean, I have it even pulls up the paper it's plagiarized from. So I have them both in front of me on the screen, and he'll still deny for quite some time. And I finally cracked him on it. But
yeah,
I guess we just write really similarly. Yeah, for 9 straight pages.
you know, I mean, honestly, I would, if I had to coach a student up on cheating, if you get caught, own up to it. I think that's, you face the consequences.
Exactly. Exactly.
You know,
yeah.
cheating and procrastination, you better be really, really good at both of those.
Truly. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, Marty, I think we're probably about out of time for this one. I could talk to you all day about these topics, though.
Yeah, I have about 900 more stories.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't doubt that at all. We might have to do this again at some point, but
yeah,
for now, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
All righty.